Good afternoon, everyone, for all of those joining us. Welcome to this Chatham House webinar, which is looking at the recent Algerian parliamentary elections and asking what do the results mean for Algeria's people and its politics. We're going to try and dig into that question over the coming hour, and I'm delighted to be joined by an excellent panel. Joining us are Dr. Amel Boubacar, who is a tenure-track professor at Marseille University and a senior research fellow with the Arab Reform Initiative. We're also joined by Dr. Dalia Ghanem, who is a visiting senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund, and by Dr. Jeff Porter, who is the president of North Africa Risk Consulting and a professor at Fordham University. And I am Tim Eaton. I'm a senior research fellow within Chatham House's Middle East and North Africa program, and I'll chair the discussion. So, before we get started, just to flag how this will work, what we'll do is we'll start off with some questions for our panelists, a couple of rounds. For those of you joining, please do start to put your questions together in the chat function, and then we will collate those questions and start to ask them to the panelists once we've gone through a couple of rounds. So that's how it's going to work. We are on the record here today, and this is being recorded. So with that very brief note, then let's make a start. So Dalia, welcome to the webinar. Thank you so much for joining. I wanted to start with you. Of course, these are the very first parliamentary elections since the end of the Iraq protest movement, and voter turnout we know was historically low, and many opposition candidates were disqualified. I wondered if you could start us off. What are kind of from your perspective, the big takeaways from these elections? And to what extent do these elections threaten to further undermine the role of Algeria's parliament?
So thank you, Tim, for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. So I have three takeaways. If you look at the official headlines coming from Algiers right now, this week, you will hear the narrative of, institutional completion and modernization, that the state has successfully wrapped up its post 2019 period transition, and of course that the FLN is the ultimate the victory is for the FLN. The state will also, and the narrative that you will see will point to the fact that, for instance, there was a lot of university degree people who participated in the list. And it's true because there was over 4,000 people who held a university degree. So there is institutionalization, there is modernization to a certain point, we can't deny. But I think the truth is elsewhere. The real story of July 2nd is not who went to the ballot box. It is the overwhelming silence of the 80% of Algerians who simply decided not to go to the ballot box and not to bother to leave their homes. So one can argue, and I think this is the provocative takeaway of this, I would argue that, that this 80% abstention rate, which is historical, by the way, is a sign to a certain extent that the Iraq is not totally dead. It simply evolved and turned and morphed into something else, something quite a crushing refusal to play by the game of the regime. I think the Iraq has transformed from a visible street movement, very vocal, very present, very physical, into a massive consensual and passive boycott. And I think what the Algerians succeeded in doing again is to simply, set publicly by withholding, their presence. The Algerian public has effectively denied the new parliament the one thing that the Algerian regime was craving, which was the domestic legitimacy. So that is for the first takeaway. The second takeaway, very quickly, I would say that the regime has successfully, built a highly loyal, sterile parliament. So the army is still the army, the presidency is still the presidency, but the parliament is weaker than ever. It remains structurally subordinate to a hyper-dominant executive branch. The third takeaway, it is the hyper-managed pluralism of Algeria. I talk about it in my book, Understanding the Resilience of Semi-Authoritarianism. You know, there is competitive authoritarianism in it, there is competitiveness. So this election is also, you know, a way to show that there is a modicum, you know, of democracy. But I think what the regime did is that by allowing traditional secular parties like the FFS, the RCD also back into the fold, into the game, but also by checking, you know, I think Amal will talk probably about it, that there was a high level of eligibility rules. Everything was really, you know, very controlled. And I think the state practiced a sophisticated form of managed pluralism. It offers the illusion of a full political spectrum while ensuring the loyalist core is never threatened and the FLN is still, you know, the old, you know, party that is still very crucial for Algerian politics.
Thanks so much, Dalia. I think three really clear takeaways there. That's a really helpful way, I think, to start. Amal, let me bring you in now. Dalia was mentioning there the hyper-pluralized management and these sophisticated strategies that are kind of being adopted by the regime in her view. I want to press you perhaps on what you think the significance of the disqualification of opposition candidates was. And what do you think this means for the nature of contentious politics in Algeria moving forward? Is this signaling some kind of change? Is it more of the same? How should we view this?
Well, I think I would answer from the level of the candidates before answering from the level of the system or the regime, because a candidate who is removed before the vote loss, before the vote actually loses more than a place on the list. I mean, in many Algerian localities, because this is also where legislative elections are built, candidacy for a local candidate, that's a public test. I mean, they are like, okay, people know me, I have a name here, I can speak in this place without being illegitimate. And when his file or her file is rejected, the damage is indeed political, but it's also social, it affects reputation and so on. This is what I have seen on the ground during these last elections. And as Dalia mentioned, Algeria has lived with managed elections for a long time. There's nothing new, and parliament has been weak for a long time. We know that. So I will avoid presenting 2026 as if control had suddenly appeared. I think the real question is who actually becomes intolerable as a candidate after the Hirak. Because as we all know, the Hirak did not leave behind a party. It left behind people with a certain public credibility, lawyers, teachers, journalists, local activists, and so on. And they are not always national figures. So often they are just known in one city, one neighborhood, one profession. I can think about a very specific ordinary local profile, a small business owner, and it's someone known in one town because people saw him during the Hirak, because he helped families of detainees, because or simply because he became reliable in a local affair, local dispute. And if that person is barred, the effect is not only on the ballot. People around those people, or around them, around these candidates, also read it as a warning, because the message is understood. And once such people try to enter on an electoral list, then the authorities, they face a different problem, because you don't have no longer just citizens who are protesting, you suddenly have possible representatives, and candidate exclusion becomes revealing at that point. I believe the official language for not accepting file is corruption, illicit money, suspicious networks, and so on. So this is not something that is to be dismissed too quickly, because of course we are in a post-late Bouteflika period, and people remember how seats, business interest, money, and so on became mixed, and the promise to clean political life can sound legitimate, but the difficulty is the discretion of the procedure. And we can ask questions especially when we are looking at local candidates, about who is removed, who stays, who decides, and when the rules are opaque. Anti-corruption can clean political life, but it can also sort actually the field before voters enter the story. So the file becomes political before the campaign begins, and the candidate is judged less by voters than by an administrative reading of who they are connected to, who they may represent, and whether their presence can be managed. And to answer your question, for contentious politics, I see two effects. The first one is quite known. Some people withdraw and they are like, okay, why vote? Why run? Why expose myself if the file can be blocked even before the campaign begins? But withdrawal is not the same as consent. And of course, there's frustration. And this frustration can move into other fields, like disputes over local administrations and so on. And they are not always framed as opposition. They often begin as practical complaints, but in Algeria, practical complaints, they can become political very quickly when people, and that's my main point, feel that the state is ignoring them or asking them to wait indefinitely. So I would not expect a direct line from candidate exclusions to mass protests. That will be too simple. But the likely effect is that people, of course, will have less trust in parties, and we will have more caution among local figures. So the multiplication of independent lists that I have seen also on the ground show also that politics is expressed through social claims, and not that much about in terms of electoral competition or ideological competition. So nowadays, the Algerian system still knows how to hold elections, but the harder task is to make people believe that elections are the place where representation happens. And that's the significance of the disqualifications for me. Those disqualifications are not only about who can stand, but they are about how narrow the road has become between public credibility and formal politics.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Amal. That's, I think, fascinating, and I'm sure a point that we'll delve into a little further in the discussion to come as well. Jeff, let me turn to you now. So I think we've heard here as well what perhaps a little bit about what these elections show us, don't show us, withdrawal doesn't equal consent, etc. I wonder, from your perspective, what's your sense of what these elections are showing us versus what they're missing? How important of a role do Algerians see for elections in their political system at the present time?
Yeah, thanks, Tim. And hi, Amal, hi, Daya. Thank you for having me. That's a really good question. I think what's interesting about the legislature, the parliament, and the legislative elections as a consequence is that they are components of a more elaborate political system, but they are not a core component. And that system includes both formal institutional structures as well as informal pathways for political participation. I think, as Alma mentions, the parliament is important in that it serves as a pathway for the practice of political power for its members. And then subsequently, its members serve as touch points for the population to compel the state to respond to their complaints or their grievances. But as Ahmad mentioned as well, that most of these grievances that the electorate has are quotidian, or as she said, social, and they're not ideological or visionary. So, and as Dahlia said, at 80% abstention rate, I think most of the potential electorate recognizes that the outcome of the legislative elections may shift. It may shift the personalities or networks of individuals who are in parliament, but it doesn't really shift policy, right? So there's a disconnect between the outcome of the elections and any potential policy changes in the future government. For many of the voters, whether it's Haj Musa or Musa al-Haj, as the winning candidate, either one is as likely or is as capable of responding to a constituent's complaints as the other one. It's neither here nor there. And then that candidate is as likely or as capable of relaying those grievances or complaints higher up the decision-making hierarchy. So it doesn't really matter necessarily who the candidate is, and who the winner is, except to the extent that it may shift local networks. But that candidate, whether he or she is affiliated with this or that party, is going to be the touch point for the electorate or their constituents to try to elevate their social complaints to the government and compel them to respond.
Got it. Thanks so much. Jeff, I want to stick with you as well. I guess in talking about how people feel about these polls, I mean, to what extent is this low turnout an indictment of the state's policies more widely?
Yeah, I don't think it is. And the reason I say that, I think it's helpful to zoom out a little bit, about what voters want, what the Algerian electorate, I think, wants from the elections, and also to look at the broader profile of the party system in Algeria. I think one of the characteristics of the party system in Algeria is that the parties themselves don't really have substantially distinguishable policy platforms, right? They have orientations, but they don't really have a roster of policy proposals that they would bring to the parliament and serve as a basis for their participation in the parliament. And I think this is due to several factors. The first is that the political space is not really, in Algeria at least, is not really characterized by identity politics, in the way it is in other democracies. It's not characterized by issue voting. It's interesting. The United States right now is very focused on these 80-20 issues, right? Where 80% of the electorate, it rallies behind an issue, and then there's a 20% minority that is taking the other position. And Algeria doesn't really have 80-20 issues around which parties and voters can galvanize. I mean, for example, there's no debate about universal health care. There's no debate about transgender in men's sports. I mean, these are issues that simply don't exist in Algeria. Secondly, political parties don't have dedicated full-time staff, and this is more sort of a practical component. They don't have staff that conducts, polls, focus groups. They don't trial issues with the electorate, et cetera, and that, sort of limits the degree to which parties are really able to differentiate themselves with the voters. And then lastly, I think, and this addresses Dahlia's point, I think voters recognize that policy doesn't originate in the legislature. Instead, policy originates elsewhere. And the legislature and members of parliament and the winners of the elections can be used to gauge the popularity or the lack of popularity of policies that are proposed by the presidency. And the legislator can be used to raise grievances with the state more broadly. But I don't think voters see the legislature and members of parliament as vehicles for the expression of their visions for the future of Algeria. And that's it. I mean, the legislature is a pragmatic tool, not a visionary or policy tool. And then you have, well, we can address this later, but then there's a whole other element of the political system that exists in parallel to the legislature, which is probably more effective. But I'll leave it there.
Thanks,
Tim,
Jeff.
if I can jump in here and finish on something. I agree with what Jeff just said, but I will add something. We don't have polls, but I think if there was a poll right now about the popularity of Tebboune, it will be very high. I don't think this result is an indictment, of Tebboune or his government. I think the parliament is a different beast in the minds of Algerians, in the sense that they simply don't take it seriously enough. Because as you said, Jeff, you said it nicely, Hajj Musa Musa al-Hajj. And when the Hirak took up to the street, you remember the slogan was Itnahawga, which means remove all of them, right? So in the mind of the Algerian, I think there is this, idea that they are still the same, pawns, and we don't care about really what the parliament does. And you can see the level of popularity of the parliament, for instance, on social media, with all those videos that make fun of parliamentarians, right? To add to that, it's very important to note, that today there is less than 2% of Algerians who trust political parties, and only 4% of them have a political activity in a political party, right? So what matters right now, I think, it's whether the assemblies, can actually deliver on a daily socio-economic urgency for the normal Algerian.
Okay, thank you for that, Dalia. And I think you partially addressed one of the questions in the Q&A. Please, for the audience members, keep sending those in. Those are great. And I think we're also seeding some topics that would be really interesting to explore in the open discussion to follow. But Amal, perhaps sticking with this issue on how people feel about policies and perhaps what changes might come about as a result of these elections. I think you wrote ahead of the 2024 presidential elections that elections do serve as a sort of barometer for the regime to map areas of support and competition, and that in the past low participation has calibrated some changes in policies. We heard earlier that perhaps the legislative isn't necessarily the policy-making center, but is it a potential outcome here that some of this historically low turnout will be looked at by the regime, and we might see some shifts in policy as a result?
I still think elections are useful for the authorities as a barometers, but I mean that in a very practical sense, because indeed they tell the regime who still moves, which party offices still work, and more important, which local notables can still bring people together. The turnout is low, around 21%, and I think that figure is severe as usual, but it's not a surprise falling from the sky. The 2021 legislative elections had already shown very low participation, and the 2024 presidential elections also left a problem around turnout and credibility. For these elections, the morning of the vote actually says a lot. Election day was made a paid public holidays, and the authorities wanted participation. And at 10 a.m., turnout was around 3%. So that image is useful because it's almost banal, actually. But people had time, and the polling station was open, and the state has organized the ritual. But many households were actually looking elsewhere. They were looking at prices, salaries, housing, the cost of sending a son abroad, and so on. And this is not grand opposition. It's, I would say, a colder form of distance. So we can read that as apathy, but I won't. I think that in Algeria, staying away from the polling station does not mean staying away from the state. And that's my main point, actually. Many people expect little from parliament and still expect a great deal from the state. And I think this is one of the paradoxes of Algeria today, because electoral expectation is weak, but state expectations remain extremely high. And people may not believe that a deputy will change their life, but they still expect the state to distribute housing, regulate prices, open jobs, protect purchasing power, answer local shortages, and so on. So when elections lose credibility, these expectations, they do not disappear. And I would say that they land somewhere else. And a young graduate may ignore the campaign, but still follow employment shames. You may not care that much about the number of FLN seats, but you will track every housing announcement and so on. So the vote measures a weak representative channel, but it also shows how much pressure is pushed back onto administration, onto social spending, onto local management. So could low participation lead to calibrate policy changes? Yes, but possibly, but I will not make it automatic, because the authorities read many signals at the same time. And elections are one signal among others. The low turnout is just one signal among others. And the usual answer in Algeria is rarely a clean political opening. More often, you will see a mix of social announcements, of administrative adjustments, some redistribution, a tighter control over who can organize, speak, or represent in the framework of elections. So this mixing of way to govern, that can work for a while, and it can even produce stability, indeed. But I think my main point is that it puts enormous pressure on everyday state performance, and that's what I'm really attentive at to actually when I'm analyzing the afterwards of these elections.
Thanks so much, Amal, and thanks for also flagging what you are looking for in the coming period. I want to, just before we open up and start answering our audience's questions, just come to you again, Dalia, to ask you how you think the ruling FLN will be interpreting these results, and what do you think we should be looking out for in the weeks and months ahead as a result? Do you expect clear consequences for any of this? I guess building on what Amal was talking about.
Well, clearly, I think the FLN will capitalize on this, under Abdel Karim bin Barak. They will see that they will interpret these 90 seats as the definitive mandate, with a victory, even though they lost a handful of seats by comparison to 2021, but yet they will spin this as, the validation of stability also, and the triumph for Algeria al-Jadida, the new Algeria that the Tebboune promised post-Hirak. I think they will also view the result as the ultimate proof that the FLN remain, despite everything, the indispensable anchor of the civilian administration in the post-Hirak Algeria. What to look out for? Three things. The first one is the government formation and the coalition math. It's very important to watch how now the FLN, the RND, and the Mustaqbal are going to formalize, their alliance to replace the technocratic government set up by Sifir Riyab. I think the distribution of portfolios is very important, because depending on the portfolio to whom you give it, it has, the distribution of portfolios will tell us a lot about the internal balance of power between traditional parties, apparatuses, and the presidency preferred loyalists. The second thing, and this will bring me to what Amal said. Amal, you said it put a lot of pressure on state performance. I think, yes, this is the second point, the socio-economic pressure vs the political inertia. So this new parliament takes shape during, despite everything, a difficult, economic fiscal challenges. Of course, if you compare Algeria, it is doing better than its neighbors. Algeria is flying high, especially since it doubled down on its export of LNG to Europe with the war on Ukraine, and then the Iran crisis with the GCC. But yet, this is still an economy that is highly reliable on hydrocarbon, that did not diversify entirely. And the IMF actually just wrapped up its article review last week. And the numbers tell the real story behind the 20% of vote turnout. The regime is running a double-digit fiscal deficit at 10.5 or 6% of GDP just to subsidize social peace. So again, to placate your population, you need money. You need to pump money. And this put extra pressure on a state that is, what we call in French, la générosité nécessaire de l'État, meaning it is a generous state, but by default, because it doesn't have any other way on how to placate the population. It's the carrot and the stick. So when the carrot will be missing, and I don't wish that, it means that the economic grievances will be boiling. The parliament usually comes here as a social buffer, but because the parliament is weak and the Algerians do not trust it, so the parliament will not be in a position to complete its traditional role. So there will be no buffer. So what will happen? So the social pressure and economic pressure is very important. And the third point is the security first foreign policy. And this is, I think, something to watch. Algeria, since 2022, has been trying to come back on the regional and international scene. This is a country that organized the Arab League Summit in 2021, the Mediterranean Game in Iran in 2022, I think, too. It received the Pope recently in a historic visit. We've seen also all kinds of European leaders going to Algiers and coming, with compliments about how Algeria is a reliable economic partner. But again, and I say that with all, the possible objectivity that I can have, I think it is a great and a big country, but it is still punching below its weight. Algeria's foreign policy could be better, could be much better. Unfortunately, and I think we were having this conversation with Geoff before we went online, this is a country that can do so much, even at the regional level, but it is still struggling to get out of the mentality of the security first. And unfortunately, Algeria had pretty bad diplomatic friction with France, with Morocco, with some Sahelian countries. It is also a country that used to be a heavyweight in terms of mediation, specifically in Mali and in the Sahel, but unfortunately it lost that position. So I think there will be something to watch at that level when it comes to Algeria foreign policy posture.
Thanks so much, Dalia. Fascinating. I think it'd be great as well in the conversation to come to get on to talk a little bit about some of Algeria's foreign policy. There are a couple of questions from our audience about specifically on that. But let's come to some of those questions now from the audience. And what I'll do, I think I'm going to group three together and then send it around the panel for you to respond. And perhaps I want to start off with that question, which I think was briefly touched upon earlier by Dalia in one of her responses. But Sophie asks, are there any independent opinion polls or surveys in Algeria? And then I wanted to connect perhaps some of this to Heba and then Anthony's question. Heba asks, do Algerians want accountability from their government? And wasn't that one of the purposes of Hirak? And does the apathy towards the parliamentary election reflect a lack of belief in its ability to hold the government accountable? I presume the parliament there. And perhaps a question from Anthony more on the nature of the opposition, as Amal touched on. But could you say more about the profile of opposition and social movements following the Hirak in Algeria. Is there a shift away from looking to change the political system towards raising a concrete social and economic and environmental grievances? And so perhaps Amal, I'll start with you on that and any of the other points you want to touch upon, and then Jeff, I'll go to you and Dalia on those questions.
Yeah, thank you, Tim, and thanks for these questions. I think there's a shift, but I would not describe it as a simple move from political demands to social demand. I mean, the Hirak itself was never only institutional. People were asking for a different political system, of course, but they were also speaking about dignity, corruption, contempt, economic exclusion, the feeling that the country had been confiscated. And what has changed after the repression of the Hirak is the form of in which claims can appear. It has become much more harder to organize, of course, openly around systemic political change. And many activists have been prosecuted, associations have been weakened, journalists have been pressured, and so on. So some of the opposition space has fragmented, but you still have political activists, lawyers, journalists, families of detainees, diaspora networks also, and so on. But they operate in a much more constrained environment. And at the same time, as I said in the first round, the grievances, they come back through concrete issues. Water shortages, housing delays, unemployment, prices, local services, and so on. I think that there's a shift, but not from politics to non-politics. After the Hirak, it became much more harder, as I said, to organize, and the opposition scene is more fragmented and cautious, but the grievances have not disappeared. That's my point, and they have become more concrete, more local, and also much more harder to read from outside. So in Algeria today, a social grievance can be maybe the safest available language for a political claim. Maybe to have asked question, do Algeria want, I would keep it very short, do they want accountability from their government? Yes, but I would not confuse again abstention with lack of demand for accountability. The Hirak was very much about accountability, corruption, and so on and so on. But many Algerians do not believe parliament can hold real power to account. So low turnout may reflect not indifference, but a judgment that the electoral channel is too weak to produce accountability. So abstention is not necessarily the absence of accountability demands. It can be the refusal to pretend that this parliament can provide them. There was a question on quotas. Yes, quotas are partly, no, that was a question on women. And we had quotas for women to be included in political parties in 2012, and they allowed a great number of women to be present in the parliament, but they were also partly artificial because that is true, and that's the case for many inclusion mechanisms, actually, because the point of quotas is precisely to correct a political field that is actually already unequal. So the weakness in Algeria was not that quotas existed. The weakness was that parties often used them formally without building women's political careers, local bases, or authority inside the party. So women's representation in Algeria declined because I believe legal inclusion somehow moved faster than party transformation. And there was a question on poll. Yes, we have, there are surveys, but not the kind of independent electoral polling that would allow us to say confidently what Algerians actually intended to vote before the election. And that is why turnout becomes so important, and it is one of the few public indicators of political distance, even if we should read it carefully.
Thanks so much, Amal. Jeff, over to you on any of those elements that you might want to pick up.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. Yeah, I mean, to Hiba's question about do Algerians expect accountability from the government? Yeah, but as Amal said, they do expect accountability, but they do not see the parliament as a means of securing that accountability, right? That there are other ways in which the population can hold the government accountable or demand accountability, and that's not necessarily through the formal institutional avenues that the elections represent. And so I would also take issue with with something that with Dahlia said about the government needing finances to placate the population. I'm not sure, and my issue is with the word placate. I'm not sure that social spending is so much an attempt to buy off the population. So, say, okay, we are giving you a raft of social services in lieu of political participation. Um, and as a consequence, the population should be content without political participation. I mean, I think placate should be reversed. I mean, the population expects those social services, and when the government doesn't provide them, then the government is failing. It's not as if the government is buying the social peace. It's simply the government has the obligation to provide these services. So it's a slight nuance, but I think it's important. And in terms of the opposition, it's when I'm in Algeria, I don't. I mean, I focus on the economic and commercial components, so I don't spend a lot of time focusing on political parties or political grievances or political aspirations. And I think when the focus of the question is on politics and opposition, there's a tendency to find politics and opposition, right? But in my day-to-day encounters, in Algiers, politics are not front of mind for most Algerians. What's front of mind is, I think, something that Amal and Dalia have both mentioned, cost of living, the supply of public utilities, the cost of electricity, the cost of gas, the cost of, fuel for your car, foodstuffs. Those are front of mind, not the ideological orientation of the state, not, Algeria's foreign policy posture. And as a consequence, when we have forums like this, we're looking for the vibrancy of the opposition. But, I think in most people's day-to-day lives, the opposition doesn't really matter. And to a certain extent, the government doesn't matter either, so long as it can provide the things or respond to the quotidian grievances that people have. Tim, do you mind if I just jump real quick? I noticed that Catherine had a question on shale and unconventional. If not, we
Sure,
can
go
get
ahead.
back to it.
Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, Catherine, how are you? It's been a while. Yeah, so there's been a lot of discussion about the development of unconventional energy sources, particularly around Ain Saleh, Anet, et cetera, down in the south. And as Catherine points out in her question, the initial exploitation of shale gas around Ain Saleh in 2015 instigated a series of demonstrations and protests against environmental degradation and exploitation of limited water resources. I think in the last 12 years, the government has tried to address the local population's concerns about what shale gas exploitation or unconventional gas exploitation would mean for the local populations. I don't know the degree to which those efforts to sort of mollify the local population's concerns have been successful, but the government has certainly responded to that initial opposition to unconventional exploitation, and they have tried to address the local concerns over the last 12 years. If the government is able to finalize contracts for the exploitation of shale or unconventional, that exploitation will go ahead. And I don't think that, well, one, I don't think that there's going to be the same level of opposition as there was 12 years ago. And two, if there is opposition, I don't think that's going to derail the development of those assets. So I just wanted to put that on the table. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Jeff. Dalia, I'll come to you. Anything further you wanted to pick up on those earlier questions, please go ahead. But also
Yes.
there's a direct question from Sabina as well. Perhaps also this might be a moment to pivot to the foreign policy element that you dangled slightly earlier. And Sabina asks how internal social pressure may affect foreign policy actions, ambitions. And there are also two specific Libya questions, which, for my own proclivities, I'd be interested to see if you see any implications here or any potential shifts. So this is a classic thing in Chatham House where I've thrown 7 questions at you at the same time, but please feel free to pick up on the threads that you think are most interesting.
Sure, thank you, Tim. I'll pick up on Job and what he said about shale gas. I agree with his point and his views, but I'm not sure whether the population will go ahead with that again. Remember, we are in a country that is 70% composed by youth, and these youth are highly, urbanized, highly educated, and highly connected. I always give the same example. When Black Lives Matter movement started in the US, there was the same that was picked up in Algeria, where Algerians used this to say we matter to population of the south of the country. So they are highly connected. They know what these kind of extractive resources and action can do to their land. And there is still in the south this feeling, I did research about it in very rich regions in Wargla and Hassim Saud, and people had this sentence that stayed with me. People will always tell you that we are محجورين في بلاد البترول, which means we are those that are miserable, if I may say, in the land of oil, because they don't see really the positive effect of oil and gas extraction. So I think that Algerian government, and this is a policy recommendation, I think they should avoid what they did in the first place, which is better communication. They need to better communicate with their population to make them understand what are, the challenges, but also the assets. Transparency is key. If there are challenges, they need to tell them. And I think, this is what Algerians are lacking a bit. To come back to just a point on women, women, the quota law has been dropped. So we don't have the quota anymore. It's not mandatory anymore. That was important to say. On the opposition, I think there is something that we underestimate also is the regime toolbox in fragmenting, co-opting, and cloning political parties and associations. Cloning, for instance, they are masters in cloning, parties and civil society organization. By cloning them, they make them actually weaker. Remember that in Algeria in 2012, the country used to be the country in the Arab world with the most or the biggest number of CSO, civil society organization. We had something like 92,000 civil society organization. And so this serves the regime into making the rest weaker. It's basically, a strategy that has been, used for decades, and it worked, unfortunately. On the foreign policy, and I think this is where my biggest frustration is with Algeria, and a bit of self-advertisement. My next book is called Algeria on the Global Stage, The Paradox of Influence. treats this question: why such a behemoth, why such a big country punches below its weight? And one of the reasons, it's four factors, but one of the reasons is the foreign policy. I think the first problem is a problem of image and soft power. We live in a world where narrative is everything, is almost everything. You need to have a story for yourself. I lived for almost 2 years in the Gulf. I mean, look at them. I mean, small state, a country like Qatar, for instance, 10 years ago, people could not situate that country on a map. Today, Qatar is everywhere. It does mediation, it hosts talks, it buys football teams. It has a narrative for itself. Algeria used to be seen as the Mecca of revolutionaries in the 70s, right? It was a country that, had a solid, outstanding international reputation. So what happened in between the 80s and the 90s? One could argue, yes, the civil war happened and so on and so forth. But I think the big problem is the mentality of fortress, unfortunately, that took hold of the leadership. And everything became as in, we need to protect the country at any cost, but we do not really want to engage with the rest. And I think there is a problem with that. Algeria can do a lot. Also in Africa, for instance, this is a continent, that has been, we are African at the end of the day, Algerians are African, so they need to reinvest in the African arena. I think there is also a huge, somebody asked a question about social pressure. There is no social pressure on the regime or any of the state apparatuses in terms of foreign policy. One has to understand foreign policy is the domain of the military. Only them decide about foreign policy decisions. And this is their domain. When you talk to, people in Algiers, policymakers, they want, sometimes some of them will even tell you, we don't really take decisions. You ask them about what's going on with France or what's going on with Morocco. Of course, like in any other country, nationalistic fiber is played on, to push for a certain narrative. But I think the country has a lot to do and missed a lot. Libya is one case. This is a neighbor. We could have done, the Algerians could have done much more and much better for the Libyans to avoid Libya becoming the quagmire that it has been since the fall of Gaddafi in 2011. Yet we missed it. We missed the opportunity to do something. And so we opened the door for foreign powers, such as Turkey, such as the UAE, and we can go on and on about many other interventions in the region. So I think there is a sense in Algiers that something needs to be changed in terms of power, in terms of soft power, image, narrative, and foreign policy. But whether this leadership is capable of doing it, that's another question. I think there is also, which is understandable, Algeria is a country that suffered a lot, and there is still the trauma of the 90s in which the leader in Algeria has this mentality that we need to protect the country at any cost. If it means closing it up, we will do it. Unfortunately, we are in 2026 in a highly globalized world, and this country needs to open up a bit more.
Thanks, Dalia. I think what I'll do, I want to pop one question back at you, Jeff, and then I'll come to you, Amal. Sorry for that delay, but just while we're on foreign policy, there's a question in the chat from El Hajj who asks about the contemporary relationship between France and Algeria, and the interconnections. I just wanted to add to that, just on the Libya front, for example, in recent months, we've seen some increased engagement with Libyan authorities on the border, the reopening of the Deb Crossing. Are we seeing some increased engagement there between the Algerians and the Libyans? Should we read into that? And perhaps those two elements, if you could give us your sense of that.
Yeah, thanks, Tim. I'll just keep it really brief because I am conscientious of the time and I want to give Ahmed a chance to respond. Yeah, on the France portfolio, no, I think there is a genuine. This is going to sound superficial, but there is a genuine perceptual shift, right? Now, the fundaments of the relationship between France and Algeria remain, economic and primarily economic. But um, you know, I think there is a deliberate effort on behalf of the presidency in Algeria to demonstrate to France that there has been a structural change. Now, there's a difference, of course, between an actual structural change and demonstrating there's been a structural change. But there is a conscientious effort on behalf of the government to show that Algiers is, independent of Paris. And you see that manifest in different ways, sort of in day-to-day life, and particularly with interactions with the government in Algiers. On the Libya file, yeah, I mean, I think Algeria has been trying to gain traction with different stakeholders in Libya since 2011. They've largely been ignored in favor of other actors. However, we've kind of reached this bizarre state of suspended animation in Libya where, the actors have largely remained the same for at least the last 5 years in Libya. And that's given some succor to the international energy companies that say, okay, it's not stable and we don't really have a government, but at least we know who the actors are. And I think the same thing applies with Algeria. It's not stable. We're not getting the traction that we want in terms of our vision of the political process, but we know who the actors are, and we are able to engage with them. And we can't really do anything on our western border, but we can certainly do things on our eastern borders with Tunisia and with Libya. And I think that's the extent of it. I mean, there is a rapprochement, there is inroads, but they're small, for lack of a better word. Yeah, and I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Jeff. And Amal, let's come back to you for probably the final word. There are some outstanding questions in the chat. There is a question from Mohammed about perhaps Algeria being in a deeper crisis of representation, asking what reforms are necessary to address this. There are also several points from Emmanuel, but one of them is about potential resurgence of positive sentiment towards Islamists. Your thoughts on some of these elements, which feel kind of social contract related, but also in terms of ideological persuasions and practical reforms. How do you see that?
Yeah, thank you. Just a word maybe on Algeria and France. I would be careful with the word theater. There's certainly performance in the France-Algeria relationship because both governments know that the relationship actually speaks to domestic audiences. In France, Algeria actually became a debate about not only immigration, but also security, Islam, the right, the far right, and so on. And in Algeria, that France remains useful as a symbol of colonial history, of arrogance and interference. So yes, part of the tension is staged, but it's not fake because, ambassadors have been recalled. Visas are still a political instrument. Writers or activists have become diplomatic issues and so on. So I would describe the relationship as one of conflictual interdependence. That means that the two states need each other more than they like to admit publicly. That's not, for me, that's not the best formula is that this is not a normal bilateral relationship that is interrupted by crisis. It's a crisis-shaped relationship that actually survives because the interdependence is too deep. I mean, the two countries cannot normalize the relationship, but they can also not fully exit it. So, and the question on maybe the Islamist, well, I would separate three things: religiosity, social conservatism, and support for Islamist parties. Algeria society remains deeply marked by Islam that has never disappeared, and there are also visible forms of moral conservatism in everyday life, in debates around education, family, gender, culture, beaches, event, dress, and so on. But that's not the same thing as saying that there's a simple return to Islamist parties as a political alternative. I mean, in Algeria, the Black Decade still matters. And for many families, for almost all Algerian, that's not an abstract memory. I mean, that's about fear, about displacement, about violence, and so on. So, and the memory is not experienced in the same way by everyone, because younger Algerians who did not live the 90s directly, for some of them, this is not the strongest political memory they have. It's about much more about unemployment, blocked futures, and so on. But in that context, some Islamic language can regain appeal, but not necessarily has a full Islamist programs. I do not believe in that. But much more has a language of morality, justice, dignity, anti-corruption, social order, and so on. So this is the risk that Islamic moral language becomes one of the available ways to express anger against corruption and so on may be real, but that's more difficult to, that will be difficult to manage or even to be acknowledged, because it won't be organized through political parties. And I hope that answers the question.
Thanks so much, Amal. That's a fantastic answer. Thank you. And thank you to our other panelists. We're going to need to draw to a close now. I've managed to continue my unassailable record of never chairing a meeting that finished on time. So I'm glad to continue that, but only 1 minute after. I think we could have gone a lot longer with what was a really fascinating discussion. So thanks so much to our panelists, and thanks to all of you for joining and for your questions. Apologies to those who asked questions that we didn't quite get to, but hopefully we'll get to them in the next webinar that you join. So thanks everyone, and please listen out for future webinars.